And as soon as we start to add a little bit of extra heel in the back of the shoe, then that's the exact amount of ankle range you do not get access to while you're wearing those shoes. G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to talk to you about the heels of your shoes and why they're potentially one of the most detrimental pieces of modern technology that you'll be exposed to day to day. So the main thing I want to cover in this video is one of the things that I see clinically a lot is that there's a lot of stiff ankles out there, and it's potentially one of the leading causes of a lot of general dysfunction that I see. And when I'm treating my patients, I'm always on the lookout to try and understand why someone's come in the way that they have. If you have ankle stiffness or reduced ankle range of motion, I know as a physical therapist or a physiotherapist that that is not normal. You deserve to have loose and mobile ankles and be able to express full range of motion through your ankles without any mechanical compromises or bad motor patterns creeping in terms of compensations. And when we're talking about what I find to be the biggest cause of stiff ankles, we can't have this conversation unless we're talking about footwear. These are a pair of barefoot shoes. These are the shoes that I wear to work most days. These are the shoes that I would run in. The reason why these are so important, apart from the fact that they're very limited in terms of the amount of technology associated with them, is that they don't have a heel on the back. So I don't know if you can see this, but when I put them down or lay them flat, there's no raise at the back lifting them up. Now, for some reason in the modern world, most of our shoes, whether they're business shoes, work shoes, school shoes, sport and exercise shoes, whatever they tend to be, they've now developed heels. And this is a real problem because our feet have all the heels that they need to be successful. And as soon as we start to add a little bit of extra heel in the back of the shoe, then that's the exact amount of ankle range you do not get access to while you're wearing those shoes. And if that was a one-off thing, for example, if you're an Olympic lifter and you want to have those Olympic lifting shoes that have a little bit of a heel raise on them, it does help you sort of compensate for some ankle and hip range of motion deficits. Once-off things are relatively okay, but if this is a shoe that you wear for 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week, or if it's another shoe that you wear that in total you wear all day every day that has a heel in them, then again, you're spending exorbitant amounts of time existing in a world where you're not expressing your full ankle range of motion. And as the saying goes, if you don't use it, you lose it. So the point I wanted to make in this video is if you have any hip, back, knee, ankle or foot dysfunction, go to your closet, have a look at every single pair of shoes that you genuinely wear day to day, see how many of them have a heel. And then if you have some ankle stiffness or some ankle stiffness related dysfunction, then you need to make sure that at some stage down the track, you progress yourself back down to a shoe that is flatter, that has less of a heel, so that you don't keep being forced back into that same vicious cycle of ankle stiffness, loosening it up, it stiffens back up again, and then you loosen it up again. You may or may not ever be free of that lower leg dysfunction that you may be working so hard to change. Now, I'll go through an exercise in a second that will help you decrease that ankle stiffness. So my favorite de-stiffening exercises for the ankle. It's really, really powerful, really, really important, but it will not be successful long term if you keep putting your feet back into heeled shoes. So I completely understand that the shoe industry has provided heels to our shoes for a very good reason, and that is under the expectation that when we hit the ground with our heels, that we're getting a lot more shock absorption. But the really interesting thing about this and the revolutionary aspect of this that I think a lot of people are still yet to realize is that if you go and run barefoot, which again tends to prompt you to run with more natural mechanics, it's almost impossible to heel strike when you're barefoot. What that tells me, and what that tells me about normal function and normal patterning when we run, is that running and heel striking is relatively abnormal. And it's a product of a lot of the sitting habits that we have, a lot of the poor postures and mechanics that we have, that our body tries to problem solve that by hitting the ground with our heel as opposed to hitting with our forefoot and tapping like you'll see if you run barefoot. Now, the other thing that I think is really important to touch on before we get to the exercise is that there's a real stigma around minimalist or barefoot shoes in terms of creating injury and dysfunction, and there's good reason for that. Now, the idea with barefoot shoes is it needs to be an ideal that we strive towards at some point. So obviously, if you are someone who wears heeled shoes all the time, and we're not talking about actual, thick stilettos or women's heels, we're talking about a heel that has some thickness at the back compared to the front. You've been in those shoes for a long time, and you've accrued some anatomical musculoskeletal dysfunction because of that. Again, it's unrealistic to expect that if you click your fingers and graduate straight to a barefoot shoe, that you may not have some consequences, because your ankle and your tissue is no longer used to being barefoot or minimalist in that sense. So it's going to take some time and energy to scrape away some of that accrued dysfunction, re-strengthen those feet so that you genuinely feel comfortable. So the problem that a lot of people have is that they buy a minimalist shoe or a barefoot shoe under the provision that it's a beneficial shoe for you, and then you just introduce it into your day-to-day life. You walk around all day, or you go for a run or be athletic, and your mechanics and tissue haven't yet been progressed back to the point where they can tolerate those things, so that you can very easily become sore. You can develop shin splints, you can develop foot pain or knee pain or ankle pain. But the point I want to make here is that the minimalist shoe will not be the cause of your dysfunction. It will merely expose the dysfunction that was hidden by being more in a shoe that has been altered away from the basic physiology of the foot for long enough that you've developed some dysfunction that again is being exposed by now being in a more flat environment, a more natural environment going forward. So it's really, really important that if you're someone who watches this video and this makes perfect sense to you, and you want to graduate to a more minimalist shoe to allow your legs and feet to function better long term, you have to take a long-term approach. You have to move from the shoe that you previously had that had a thick heel on it or a heel at all, not go straight from a minimalist shoe, but go down to a shoe that has a slightly lower heel, work on cleaning up your mechanics, and then when you feel comfortable again, graduate down to a lower shoe again until you eventually get to the point where you feel comfortable tolerating a minimalist shoe day to day, and then obviously taking that to the next step if you're now trying to run and be athletic and active in a minimalist shoe. So again, the most important thing to take from that point and that perspective is that any pains and aches you accrue from being in a minimalist shoe aren't caused by the shoe. That shoe is just exposing years of hidden accrued dysfunction that you had no idea was there because the heel was buffering that. So with that being said, we can now start to progress to this exercise with the right frame of mind and the right perspective to move forwards. So again, if you've been a fan of the channel, you'll know that we're going to do the banded ankle stretch. What we want to do first is we want to get a sense of how your ankle feels. So what we can do here is you can do the knee to wall test, where you have your foot up against the wall, keeping your feet straight. See if you can touch your knee to the wall. If you can get there with your toes touching the wall, that's step one. We take you back a few centimeters. It helps to have a ruler or a tape measure here. We're going to make sure that you get a very strong sense of how far back you can go before you have to lift your heel up to reach the wall, and before you get to the point where you need to start to dump inwards to work around that restriction. So again, if I'm up against the wall here, ideally that knee should translate through the middle of your foot or further outwards. It should not start to deviate towards your big toe or inside of that big toe. If it does, then it's going to compromise the position and the function of your arch. But it's also going to put everything in your entire leg in a bad position, which is why ankle stiffness is so important, because as soon as you run into a stiffness, your body doesn't work through that stiffness. It decides to work around that stiffness, and we set the whole leg up for dysfunction going forwards. So you can do the knee to wall test to get a sense of how you're going. Or what you can also do is do some basic squats, some deep squats. So by having your feet shoulder width apart and feet pointing straight, keeping your knees rotated out similar to the knee to wall stretch, you can drop down as far as you feel comfortable going before you feel like your heels have to lift up, before you feel like your feet have to turn out, before you feel like your knee has to cave in, or before you feel you have to start to fall backwards. Take a general sense of how those ankles feel as you're squatting down to your deepest position, so that when we do this banded ankle stretch, you can compare both of those tests and hopefully see an immediate change. Now, what we want to get you to do with this band, this is a power band. You can use a TheraBand or a resistance band. You just want to tie it to something that's not going to follow you, that's very stable. What we want to get you to do is take a step out as far as you feel comfortable with your tight leg, step past the band with your other leg, and then what we want to get you to do is drop your back knee and back ankle, and and bend that ankle as far as you feel comfortable. Now, if you haven't stepped far enough past the band, you might find you'll ultimately end up lunging and squatting. Is a lot harder on your thighs, but when you find that you step beyond this, you find that you can actually start to direct most of the tension through that ankle, and you can hang it here for as long as you want to. Now again, we need to pay close attention, and I'll turn around so you can see this, that when you step out with the band pulling behind you and you drop that back knee and bend that back ankle, you need to make sure that again, that you're not running into that ankle stiffness and then dumping inwards and going past that. You need to make sure that you're going straight through that stiffness to give your ankle the best chance to mobilize in the shortest amount of time. And then what you'll hopefully find is, once you recheck your basic squat shape, you should automatically feel like that ankle has a little bit more room to move. And then when you're doing your knee to wall test again, you should hopefully feel like you're automatically bringing your foot further back before your heel wants to lift up off the ground. And that exercise is easily one of the best ways to de-stiffen a chronically tight and stiff ankle, most commonly from a pair of shoes that has a heel on them. So I really wanted to make sure that I put a video out there that at least puts this idea out into the world, out into the universe, to say that if you can reduce the amount of heel in your shoe, eventually getting to the point where you feel comfortable in a flat shoe or barefoot, then you might find that there's a whole range of musculoskeletal dysfunctions that you've been dealing with can start to upregulate in ways that it may never have had the chance to if you hadn't have resolved some of that ankle stiffness and those heels in your shoes. So I genuinely hope that was helpful and insightful. If it was, please slap a like down below. Consider leaving a super thanks donation on the channel to help support us. With that being said, I'll see you in the next one.